I'm Brian Karam, and I've spent decades covering politics. Now I'm taking you behind the scenes, one interview at a time.
Join us as each week Brian confronts the issues that matter, posing the questions you wish you could ask. No filter, no agenda, just the truth.
We're not here for sound bites. We're here for substance. Join me, Brian Karam, every week as we cut through the noise and get straight to it. This is Just Ask the Question, where curiosity will lead us to the facts.
Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform, and remember, when you want answers, all you have to do is just ask the question.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. We've talked about this a bit before, but I have a little bit of a commute to get to the university where I work, and on that commute, I often listen to podcasts. Now, honestly, a lot of the time it's podcasts about podcasting, but I do also try to follow current affairs. I listen to podcast versions of a couple of evening cable TV shows, some of them on Fox News and some of them on other networks. Now, why would I do this? One of the things I've noticed is that it's easy to just decide that people that I think don't agree with me are not worth my time. However, when I do that, I don't always have enough information to really understand if my view is a good one or not. So, I try to listen to both sides in our political debate in my country today. And I will tell you, I do find some of the content to be pretty biased. I find this on both sides, but I am more likely to notice it for people who have political views that I do not. We've been talking about bias in the media quite a lot lately. Here in the US, from the time that Donald Trump was a presidential candidate calling news biased and fake, it's really gone up several notches. So today, I thought we'd talk about what the research says. Is the media actually biased, and has it gotten worse in recent years? What should we, as news followers, do in the face of biased information? Let's learn more. Let's get unspun. Okay, whatever you believe politically, I know that you have heard that the media is biased. Here's former U.S. Vice President Spiro Agnew, all the way back in the 1960s.
We have more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism.
Those nattering nabobs of negativism, the media who's covering the government in an unflattering way. And the message is that the mainstream media cannot be trusted, that they are in the tank for one side or the other. They have some kind of an agenda. Have a listen to this.
Some people are saying is that the IRS was used at a local level in Cincinnati, maybe other places, to go out.
Absolutely wrong.
But how do you know that? Because we still don't know what happened there.
Bill, we do. That's not what happened. Folks have, again, had multiple hearings on this. I mean, these kinds of things keep on surfacing, in part because you and your TV station will promote them.
That was U.S. President Barack Obama being interviewed on Fox News by at the time, popular talk show host named Bill O'Reilly. And Obama makes a statement that he thinks Fox News chooses stories to run that are going to make the federal government look bad. Or in other words, Fox News is biased. And what's really interesting is that both sides say it. Progressives say the media bends over backwards to normalize right-wing extremism. Conservatives say the media is hopelessly liberal. And it's not just in the U.S. Check this out.
We can see the results aren't that great.
Well, St. Jacinda could do no wrong, again, in the eyes of the leftist media. She was championed, really, for her behavior in handling the COVID pandemic. She had very draconian rules. She was very harsh. She locked out her own people. And as you said, some of the toughest restrictions in the world. She's obviously moved on from her prime ministership before she got pushed out.
That was a Conservative commentator on Australia's Sky News, and she was talking about former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Back during COVID, New Zealand dealt with the early months of the disease with a very isolationist policy. And just like lockdowns were not popular in other countries, there were people in New Zealand who found them to be an intolerable restriction. This isn't about that, though. The commentator is complaining that the media itself was not doing enough to call out the Prime Minister's decisions. It was biased in favor of the more liberal politician. So, like I said, it's both sides. And they can't both be right. But maybe they can. Because I think the more interesting question is, what do we actually mean when we say bias? And it turns out that it's a harder question to answer than it sounds. A researcher named Robert Entman laid out a framework of 3 types of bias back in 2007. That is the one that most researchers still use. So first, there's distortion bias. That is just factual incorrectness, lies, making things up. If a news outlet reports that something happened when it didn't, or quotes someone saying something they never said, that's distortion bias. Second is content bias, and this one is more subtle. It's unequal treatment. Maybe covering one party's scandals exhaustively while barely mentioning the others, which is what the Sky News commentator was just complaining about. Maybe it's giving favorable sources more airtime or promoting them with your social media algorithm. And maybe what you call an honest mistake from one side, you'll call a massive scandal on the other, even though they did the same thing. The facts might all be accurate, but the pattern of what gets covered is creating a systemic tilt. Third is decision-making bias. This is about who journalists are and what they believe, where they're from, how educated they are, maybe their income when they're growing up, their political leanings, their ideological posture. And this type matters because it influences the other two, but it's also the hardest to measure because what you believe doesn't automatically translate into the way that you report the news as a journalist. Most research focuses on that second category, content bias, in part because it's the easiest to measure, and in part because it just matters a lot. Now, the oldest way to measure this is called content analysis. So you get human coders, or increasingly now AI, to read articles or watch broadcasts and decode them for the tone, who the sources are, what was the angle on the story, what stories got chosen. So for example, there's a study from the 2023 Slovak elections where researchers built what they called a media political bias index by measuring 3 things: visibility, which was how often each party appeared, exposure, or how much time or space they got, and then overtone, whether the coverage was positive or negative. And this kind of study works, but it is very labor intensive because humans can only code so many articles in a period of time. And even with very clear rubrics, different coders sometimes disagree about if something is framed positively or negatively. For example, if you say that someone cut the budget to the bone, for people who are interested in small spending, that's positive, right? But for people who are interested in preserving services, it might be negative. Researchers have increasingly turned to AI. You can train a model with what content looks like in a news article or a social post or whatever, and let it analyze millions of articles at scale. And now, in some ways, that can be a good thing. One review found that these AI models can pick up these really subtle choices, whether it's something positive or negative, and it can find patterns where something is repeated for emphasis that human coders can miss. On the other hand, though, computer models are far from perfect. They still have something of a problem detecting sarcasm. And now humans do too. I'm recording in June of 2026, and a popular gotcha on social media right now is to take something like a real Monet painting, post an image of it, say it's AI, let people bash it, and then say, man, people are dumb. But when it comes to something like satirical news, like The Onion or The Daily Show, algorithms also sometimes fall short. Another problem the review found was that researchers don't all define bias the same way. So maybe one study codes for what stories get covered, that's selection bias. Another codes for what facts within a story get left out, or an omission bias. And they're all measuring something that's real, but they're not measuring the same thing. So when you want to say research shows that the media are biased, that can be a little bit of a problem. But it's not like the research is worthless. There was one smart study that found that there's a left-right bias like you'd expect, but there's also an establishment versus an anti-establishment orientation. Some news outlets are much more likely to cover what business leaders and politicians say. Others are more likely to cover what demonstrators say. And that's a bias too. Another method looks at who's in the audience. There was something called the Media Bias Monitor System, and it pulled data from the Facebook advertiser tools, which tracks who follows which news pages, and then used that to estimate whether an outlet's audience skewed liberal or conservative. And they assumed that the audience for a publication could tell you if the publication had a biased perspective. They applied this to more than 20,000 Facebook news pages, and it worked pretty well. Another study did something similar, but using Twitter sharing patterns. If most accounts that share an article are known to lean one direction, which you can tell from the profiles, that can be evidence that the article itself has that slant. Also not perfect, but pretty good. Another way is quote analysis. Who are the sources or who gets to speak? One study found that conservative-leaning outlets systematically choose quotes that portray a liberal president more negatively, while liberal-leaning outlets do the opposite. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this, and it shows us something important. What it shows us is that bias is real and that you can find and measure it. But that's not the whole story. Research has also found that ideological differences between news organizations do exist, but they're much smaller than most people believe. Usually, news organizations show their ideology by disproportionately criticizing one side more often than they do by advocating for the other. So, for example, in a study, Fox News didn't run segments explicitly endorsing Republican policies as much as they ran segments criticizing Democratic ones, and MSNBC did the reverse. So it's negative partisanship, but not positive advocacy. And there's another wrinkle. Ordinary people think things are a lot more biased than they objectively are. There's been a whole bunch of studies that have found that a person in the audience's own partisanship predicts how much they perceive something to be biased a lot more than the actual content does. It may be neutral, but people think it's biased. And the studies are pretty clear on this. You can show the same article to a liberal and a conservative, and you can ask each if it's biased, and they will give you the opposite answers. Not because they're stupid or lying, but because they're filtering the content through different frameworks in their own head. Now think about this. When politicians claim the media is biased, are they describing objective reality, or are they revealing their own perception? When you have governments that are willing to push penalties on the media for bias, this really kind of matters a lot. Former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was quite vocal about media properties run by Rupert Murdoch, who runs Fox News in the US and Sky News in the Pacific. Listen to how confident Turnbull is here.
The Murdoch media empire has enormous political power. It is the most potent political force in Australia. It does not operate as a conventional news or journalistic operation any longer. Its influence in the United States, in Britain, in all of the countries where it is to be found is now utterly partisan. It is more like a political party, but the only members are the Murdochs. And as you know, it has driven populist right-wing agendas, denying climate change, supporting extremism on the right of politics, of populist politics, to the extent, most irresponsibly of all, you might think, supporting the proposition that Joe Biden had in fact stolen the election and was not legitimately elected president.
Sounds like there's no question in his mind that Murdoch's properties are biased or politically aligned. And we're going to come back to this question because it's really important when you think about what you might expect or tolerate from your leaders. Before we continue, I just want to remind you all that as my audience, I do really want to hear from you. I'm on Blue Sky at Dr. Sturge, DrSturg, and you can also email me at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. And I'd love to know your thoughts on this episode or the show in general. What topics do you want to hear about Unspun? Okay, we hear about media bias a lot right now, and that made me wonder, is the media bias changing? Is it getting more biased over time, and is it worse now? Well, the short answer is yes, by most measurable dimensions, but the long answer I think is a little bit more interesting. So one clear example is cable news. A 2025 study in Scientific Reports analyzed nearly 10 years of TV news comparing cable and broadcast. And your big network news, your ABC, NBC, CBS, stayed pretty much the same, similar topics with similar language. But cable news stations like Fox News or CNN or MSNBC is where you really saw bigger changes, both in what they covered and in the language they used to talk about things. And here's what really surprised me. I always thought that a lot of our problem was that audiences can't really tell the difference between news and news commentary anymore because it's all blended together. Well, this study found that it was true for hard news coverage too. The evening news show has changed. It's not just opinion shows like Sean Hannity or Lawrence O'Donnell loudly complaining in primetime. And so this tells us that the changes are in the networks themselves, not just in individual editorializers. And this was confirmed in a separate study on almost all the same data. Cable news has gotten more partisan and more polarized over time. And it's how they're talking about issues, it's the words that they choose. Another study, and I thought this was pretty clever, it looked at the closed captions of news shows. They compared CNN and Fox, and they found that there were real differences for what should be a neutral presentation of what's going on, and it diverged into some pretty different messaging. By 2020, the two stations discussed identical topics in such different ways that there were barely any words in common. They were using the same vocabulary to mean different things. So, for example, when you watch CNN talking about border security, the words that appear around that phrase are completely different from when Fox News uses the same phrase. It's like they're not even having the same conversation anymore. And since we're talking about changes over time, I will say that partisanship in media itself has gone back and forth over time. Researchers have tracked U.S. newspaper partisanship from 1880 to 1980, and they found that in the 1890s, most newspapers were openly aligned with a political party. Nobody pretended they were neutral. They even printed partisan editorials on the front page. Then, across the early to mid-1900s, that norm of objectivity took hold, and journalism professionalized. News and opinion became separate. So what we're witnessing now, post-2000, might not be new. Maybe it's just a return to partisan roots after an anomaly, right? That era of professionalized objectivity. It's possible that the idea of just giving the facts or equal coverage for both sides was the historical outlier. And I'll also say that the belief that news should be objective doesn't hold everywhere. Even today, in some parts of the world, news is openly aligned with politics. But politicians still don't like it. Here's Britain's Tony Blair.
Wrong for this government. Nick, in this business, lived in the media culture we have today, where everything, look, there's no problem that isn't a crisis, no difficulty that isn't a catastrophe, no week that's not going to end up being the most terrible thing that's ever happened. You do the job. You get on with doing the job, because is the economy strong? Yes. Is the investment going into schools and hospitals? Yes. Are we taking the steps necessary to make our country stronger and better and fairer? Yes. Will that affect tomorrow's headlines? No.
Media make a crisis out of everything, Blair says, and he's clearly frustrated. So the next question is, why is this happening? Some scholars have said it's because media reflects the society it serves, and when societies get more polarized, the media, needing to keep their audience to stay alive, shifts to match. But more research kind of changes that picture, because it may be that media influence each other. Another study found that in places where there are more Fox News viewers, local newspapers get more right-wing. So maybe media bias is contagious about cross-media types. We can't forget about the audience, though. And we do have good evidence that content is getting more polarized, but that doesn't mean that the audience aligns well with the media views, especially now that there's a lot more ways to get news. There was a study that looked at people's mobile web browsing data, and they found that mobile access to news meant that people saw more diverse content. And when it came to TV, another study found that 17% of Americans are partisan segregated through television, meaning they only watch channels that align with their views. Online, that's only 4% of people. But those TV audiences, they're really dedicated. Partisan TV audiences have grown, even though the total TV audience is shrinking. And so financially, that means that if you're in the TV business, it makes sense to be partisan. So here we are. Content has changed a lot on cable, and for people who get most of their news on TV. They're most likely to be choosing news that they believe in. But for most people, because we're shifting away from TV overall, people are encountering a mix of perspectives, sometimes accidentally through their social media feeds and stuff like that. So does that accidental exposure make a difference? That's something we don't have a clean answer to yet. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we're going to look at why media bias does tend to increase. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Across centuries, media bias has changed in cycles that we can actually identify. And when we understand those cycles, it helps us to feel out we understand where we are now. One thing that causes changes is when new technologies give people more choices in how they get information. And this is a pattern that repeats. New technology tends to make it less expensive to produce and distribute news. And that will mean that there can be more news outlets that serve smaller audiences. Think about it. This happened a bunch of times. It happened when we went from cuneiform tablets to writing on paper. It went from when we went from writing on paper to printing presses. It happened when we went from printing presses to radio. We went from regular TV to cable TV, and it definitely happened with the internet. The internet has created hyper-partisan websites, and mobile technology has enabled partisan content creators, right? You don't have to haul out a huge camera and tripod and mic to make the news anymore. So anybody can be a news reporter. A researcher named Marcus Pryor documented this for cable news. When people weren't stuck with what a network put together at 6 or 11, but could choose what matched what they wanted to hear, two things happened. Number one, because news overall did get more political, people who weren't into politics gave up on following news entirely. And two, the most partisan viewers became small but dedicated audience for some kinds of content. These dedicated audiences did stick around if you match their perspective. So in order to stay afloat, cable channels tended to do that more and more. They were giving the audience what they wanted: validation and outrage and ammunition to argue with their annoying uncle. And so that meant that those small cable outlets got more partisan. And these patterns have shown up in a lot of places. There was even a study of the 19th century newspaper industry that found the same kind of thing. When your potential audience is everyone, you have to be moderate. When your potential audience is niche, you polarize. Now, another factor is when oligarchs run the news. As media consolidates into the hands of owners who might maybe need political favors to further their business interests, bias tends to go up. There's a well-cited study that looked at coverage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Some publications were owned by companies that stood to gain financially from the legislation, and others were not. And I'm not surprised that outlets who could make money covered the issue a lot more favorably than those who would not be affected, who tended to be more critical. So it looks like corporate ownership also shapes news content. It may not even be commanded from the top, right? It could just be little choices made every day by reporters and editors who want their money from their boss who still has enough of an audience to pay them. And the US isn't alone. In Chile, researchers found that when fewer people owned more news outlets, the content between them became more similar. So when big conglomerates buy up small news outlets, it changes the whole news ecosystem because there are multiple outlets all responding to the same institutional interest. Now, audience polarization matters also because news outlets make money by selling their audience's attention. As a society gets more polarized, they may expect more slanted content. And I have seen this pretty clearly here in the United States, where people will take what is fairly neutral coverage of the news and say that it must be wrong because it's not saying the right biased things. And sometimes I even think that a news outlet is doing right when both sides are angry at them. But outlets need money to survive, and that money will definitely pressure them to change their coverage to please their audience. And this creates something of a feedback loop, right? Voters become polarized. That means that polarized media becomes more profitable. Biased media content makes voters more polarized, and it's a circle. And there's some pretty influential research that documents this process. Eventually, choices start going away. A study of U.S. elections from 1944 to 1964 found that when broadcast news showed up, partisan newspapers became less influential. And this implies that when centrist or objective media dominate, they suppress partisan content. Of course, we have seen non-biased parts of the news under a lot of pressure. Consider what happened to NPR, for example, or the many local newspapers that have been lost in the last several decades. And when neutral outlets close, they're no longer checking information for people, and overall bias goes up. The final factor that some researchers suggest is more polarized politicians. And I've played you already some examples of politicians criticizing media bias. It may be that these kind of statements have an effect on the audience, which then pressures the media to be more partisan. It may also be that neutral media become more partisan in order to, kind of ironically, avoid the perception of bias. The media responds to their environment. It doesn't create it out of nothing. So putting it all together, here's the pattern. Media bias goes up when new technology means it's cheap enough to target smaller audiences, and when oligarchs buy news outlets and have to please polarizing politicians, and there's less moderate media to provide neutral facts. And honestly, the mid-20th century was because of none of the four conditions, right? The mid-20th century is the time when we had sort of objective seeming news. Broadcast technology was very expensive, so there were only 3 networks. Regulation kept ownership distributed, and political elites were relatively moderate, at least on certain dimensions. And that's no longer true. And so we're living through the consequences. The question is then, what comes next? And we'll tackle that after one more very quick break. Be right back. Welcome back. So let's get back to the original question. We've seen that bias exists and that we can measure it, but is it as bad as politicians claim? Listen to the US president in a media interview that aired recently.
Because you have no credibility.
But you've never presented evidence that it was rigged. Let's keep talking about, I want to talk about Todd.
You have more evidence. There's more evidence than ever presented.
Let's talk
Your
about
elections in this country, we're like a third world country.
Sir.
Your elections are crooked, and you're crooked. At least the press is crooked.
Mr.
And so is ABC and CBS and CNN.
But Mr. President,
You're one-sided crooked networks. So let's call it quits because I've had enough.
That was Donald Trump speaking to a reporter and leveling many passionate insults at her, her network, her industry, before he took off his microphone and stepped on it while he was leaving. Is this a ploy? When political elites claim the media is biased against them, are they trying to fool you, or do they actually believe it? The answer to this question matters because it can determine if they just want to grumble about coverage or if they want to use the levers of power to destroy your ability to be informed. So let's start with the most robust finding in research, the hostile media effect. This says that partisans reliably perceive neutral or balanced coverage as biased against them. And there's 3 decades of studies that have documented this. It's been found across countries, and it's been found across different kinds of issues. And it looks like it works through what researchers call defensive processing. People tend to give more attention to things that match what they already believe. They take note of the parts that contradict their beliefs more vividly than they do the parts that confirm them. And this is what they feel about it, not what's actually said. And opposing people watching the same coverage can both perceive it as biased against them if it's neutral. And so this is an example of a psychological phenomenon that politicians are especially susceptible to. In fact, there was a survey of politicians in 3 European countries that found that the hostile media effect holds for political elites and not just ordinary citizens. But even more important, there are consequences. Politicians who think the media is out to get them are less likely to give interviews and they're less likely to hold press conferences. They're also less likely to trust democracy itself because they believe that the public is being misinformed. In other words, they can do what they want because what they're learning about the public must be biased. So, that's a cool psychological thing to know about. It's also something, though, that changes political behavior, and it can reinforce itself. There was one study that traced how much the public believed in liberal media bias across 3 presidential elections. Their belief changed, but it wasn't because coverage changed. It was because conservative elites were yelling about the media being biased. And in an attempt to not look biased, media covered the issue of bias more as a topic. So a manufactured issue became real because enough people believed in it. And although I do try to report that people and leaders all make thinking mistakes about the media, solid research has shown that this criticism of the media by leaders does have an effect on listeners. And Republicans and conservatives are consistently more likely than Democrats to perceive and to claim media bias. And here's where that's really depressing. The thing that predicts if you're going to perceive if the media is biased or not is just what you believe in. It's also how much you hate people who think differently from you. The more you dislike the other side, the more you are likely to perceive media bias. Your attitude primes you to see any coverage that isn't negative about people you disagree with as evidence that the message must be manipulated. Experiments have found that when politicians attack a news source as biased, audiences then shift their attitudes and they see the news source as biased. This happens when politicians from either party say it. So just saying the media is biased actually works politically. And it doesn't matter what the content is, people will see it as biased. This is effective, and politicians use it deliberately. And this is important. You do have to be careful because sometimes bias really is there. Remember earlier in the episode, we talked about documented real differences between Fox and CNN, for example. A study about New York Times coverage during 2016 found that stories about Trump were significantly more likely to be negative than were stories about Clinton. And Trump said this. He said it loudly, and he said it repeatedly. And in this case, he was not wrong, at least in a way. There's always the question about whether the coverage was negative because of bias or because the person being covered did negative things. I mean, think about it. If one candidate does more scandalous things, do you want the coverage to show that? Would you prefer forced balance because that feels less biased? So we know that bias claims are sometimes BS and sometimes they reflect actual measurable slant, but we don't always know the content and the reason. And the problem with this is you can't figure this out just by listening to what politicians claim, because in practice, multiple things are often going on. A politician genuinely feels that the media is biased because they are wired to see it that way. They realize then that this is strategically useful, so they yell about it. And they have real examples of asymmetric coverage to justify themselves. And this happens all over the world. One report found that more than 40 political leaders globally, in fascist states and democracies alike, had used the words fake news to justify suppressing speech. This included censoring independent media, blocking internet access in their country, even putting reporters in jail. And the pattern matters too. Politicians attack the media more when the media is criticizing them. It's a classic personal attack strategy. Don't believe the bad things this organization is printing about me because they can't be trusted. So when you hear politicians say the media is biased, here's what you need to ask. First, is there evidence that goes beyond pointing to a story or two? Is it really a trend? I will point out that at political rallies, one candidate claimed that the biased media had stopped filming him, turned the cameras off because they disliked his ideas. But I know about this because those same media did film him saying that and published his remarks. That's how I saw it. So maybe it's not even true. If there does seem to be a lot of negative coverage, is it for a good reason, like because the person has done negative things? If the media says that under a government inflation is really high, is it because inflation is really high? Is that bias or is that just reporting the truth? Asking questions like this can help you to think about what's actually happening. Bias is real. Perception of bias is often real, and a lot of times it's disconnected from the bias that exists. But letting leaders get away with false claims can open the door for suppressing your right to know. Okay, truth seekers, thank you for staying with me and stay sharp out there. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone. It's no surprise that newsmakers try to manipulate the audience. They want you to believe that they are the one holding the line and they'll use any trick they can to get you there. But don't let them fool you. Get unspun. I'm Amanda Sturgill. I've been a reporter, and today I teach future reporters to cut the spin and think critically about what newsmakers say. My podcast, Unspun, shows you how to know when you're being manipulated by the news. Learn to spot the tricks and how to make up your own mind about what's true. So if you're tired of being fooled by the news, subscribe to Unspun today. Unspun, because you deserve the truth.